Studying genetics in ball python morphs can be a little daunting. It can take a little while to learn all of it, but when you do finally get everything down pat and learn how everything works with recessives and codons and incomplete dominants and so on and so forth, you're all set, right? Except for you're not. Because some morphs and combinations don't follow the rules. Making sense of it can be incredibly daunting, but luckily we only need to have a somewhat loose understanding of it to make cool combos and stay away from certain combos that maybe we don't want to make. So today we're gonna go over just some of what has been discovered that just doesn't follow the rules, even though there's plenty more coming every day. The first morph that we're going to discuss is the banana morph, also known as the coral glow or even the white smoke at one point. Arguably one of the most influential genes in ball pythons ever. When bananas came out, they showed the world what insane colors and combos you can make with ball pythons. But when they started being created, people started to notice something. They would get these males and they would breed them, and they would get all male bananas. Or sometimes they'd produce all females. So why was this happening? Well, it wasn't actually that long ago that it was discovered that the banana gene was linked to the sex chromosome of the snake. So in many cases, when you had a male, that male was what you call a male maker, meaning that if you have what you call a male maker banana, all of the offspring that is banana, within a margin of error, roughly what I've heard is about 5%, would be a male. Meanwhile, every single other snake that you didn't hit the banana in would be exclusively female with about the same exact odd percentage. Basically, it would take a genetic anomaly for this to change. On the flip side, if you have a female maker, it's the exact opposite. Almost every single banana will end up being a female, and almost everything else that did not hit the banana gene in it would be a male. So for example, if you bred a banana pied to a orange dream pied, everything that was not a visual banana in a male maker is going to be female, notwithstanding any genetic anomaly. And everything that showed a banana pied would end up being male. So what does it look like for females? Well, throw those rules out the door. They don't matter anymore. A female banana ball python will give birth to both males and females. It is only the males that are affected by this weird, quirky anomaly. That begs the question, how would a super banana work? Well, the female would work the same way. You would have a mixed gender results of about 50-50. And how would the males work? Would they be all male makers or all female makers? Well, now they're back to 50-50. And everything again would be banana though, and you'd have both males and females. So now you're back to kind of some semblance of normalcy when it comes to the supers at least. But the banana gene for the longest time perplexed and irritated people to no end. Nobody really understood what was happening until geneticists and scientists sat down and started paying attention to ball pythons and studying really how all of this works. Banana will always be an incredibly popular gene, but it is incredibly unique, and there's nothing quite like it that has this interaction or this connection to the gender of your snake. The next gene I want to talk about isn't even really just a gene, it's a whole family of genes, and that would be the blue-eyed leucistic family or complex of genetics. When you put a blue-eyed leucistic complex together, it should make an all-white snake with blue eyes, except when it doesn't. Super lesser, 2 copies of lesser, all-white snake with blue eyes and sometimes large eyes. 2 copies of Mojave, well, most of the time it's an all-white snake, but sometimes they have a gray head. Okay, well that one's acceptable, right? It's just a gray head. So what happens if you get a mystic Mojave then? Mystic is also a member of the blue-eyed leucistic family. Well, in that case, you don't get an all-white snake. So must have a gray head or something? No. It's called a mystic potion, and they have an almost purpley type look to them. One of the most incredible combos that you can actually create. They have the kind of faded keyhole sides, a almost purplish, lavenderish type look to them, and a very bright and luminous type pattern that you can only describe as little glow stickers that if you expose them to light and then turn off the lights that it should glow. Sadly, they do not, but that's not what's supposed to happen. They're supposed to be an all-white snake. And they're not the only ones in the Bell complex. Seems to be a pretty common theme with Mystic, so when you put 2 Mystics together, you kind of get the same thing, which is another snake that's very similar. Like I said, Mystic and Mojave are very similar. So maybe it's just Mystic and any other thing, right? Nope, because if you put a Mystic and a Lesser together, they kind of call it the karma, you get a Bell. So obviously it's not just that. And to further throw that on its head, if you put Mojave and Phantom together, you get the Purple Passion, which again brings in a lot of those purples, but I notice on a lot of those, the dorsal stripe seems to be complete. It doesn't break up any, and the pattern is more ghostly rather than the keyholes that are a little bit more defined. At least in a lot of them that I see, but that is definitely not the case in every single one of them. But there are a couple of them that definitely throw out more, as you're about to find out, because Mojave isn't out of the woods yet. When you put Mojave and Special together, you get what is called a crystal, which is not at all purple. It actually has some yellows to it, and it's very, very bright. And they almost look like they're about to become a bell. Like they're just about lightening up, and then it just stops and leaves pattern and color there. Another one, what we just mentioned, the Special, which when comboed with other sorts of morphs create an all-white snake, but when comboed with itself, similar to Mystic, creates actually an incredible looking snake. Almost washed out on the sides, but then have tints of these pretty vibrant yellows with a tinge of orange coming in on them. Pretty extraordinary just by itself, albeit I imagine it's difficult to work into many other things. But these are just some of the examples of them. For a snake that's supposed to be all white with blue eyes, there are a lot of genetics that just didn't seem to get the memo. Next up, we're going to talk about a couple genetics that are probably the most recent to be determined that they just don't follow the rules. And we're going to start off with Desert Ghost. And the reason this one doesn't follow the rules is because it's supposed to be a recessive. That is what it's still listed as. But there are actually two types of Desert Ghost. Type A and there's Type B, we found out. And there might even be more. Possibly RGI would know about that, but we don't know for sure right now as far as I know, and I'm creating this video. And these types are essentially compatible with each other. However, at the same time, they exhibit traits of both a recessive and an incomplete dominant, meaning that in some cases you're getting these combos that are being put together and it should create a Desert Ghost and you're not getting it. But at the same time, you're getting ones that you shouldn't get a visual Desert Ghost, and then you are getting a Desert Ghost. So what gives? Now, understanding all of this, it can be incredibly difficult, and for a long time there was a lot of confusion. But in reality, it really doesn't change anything. Maybe you should send in some should tests to find out if you're having issues, but if you're not, just continue as business as usual, because when you are getting these and putting them together, you are creating visual examples. And that's the thing, is that when you have the visual example, sometimes it's best to simplify things from a breeder standpoint. If it works, right? They've also determined that this C, which I believe is a thing, if you get one copy of the C with either the A or the B, sometimes they're visual, sometimes they're not, which is why there's suspected that maybe there's a little bit more at play in all of these crazy genetics. So why does this all matter if it just kind of works for you? Well, it matters in the retrospective genetic testing being a reality and a major component of what has changed in the last, honestly, 3 to 4 years, becoming more prevalent, but in the last 5 for sure. If you only thought that Desert Ghost was one thing and you tested for Desert Ghost with that one test, you could send in a visual Desert Ghost possibly and say negative because it's not the one that you had narrowed down. So it matters in that regard, becoming more confusing, and that is why it's so important to understand more and more about it. At least that's how I come to understand it. I am not a geneticist. I understand enough on how it works from a phenotype level, really, and the basic levels of how they work together. For that, I would turn your attention to Ben with RGI, a literal scientist and geneticist. That is why it's so important. Now that this is a major thing with us, it is important to understand all of this, because if you send in a shed test for another one that has just been recently discovered to have more than one type, like Ultramel. Ultramel has a type A and B, and if you thought there was only one and you are testing for one and suddenly it's a visual example of an Ultramel and you're being said no, it's not one at all, well, that becomes a problem. You need to be able to determine this. So yes, they're all Ultramels, they're all Desert Ghosts, but they're a little more funky. They don't follow the rules. It's not something that you see with your eyes in most cases, but it can be. Like I said, with the Desert Ghost, if you're getting funky results, it's time to reach out to RGI, I would say, albeit that is a very rare instance and it should not affect how you feel about these genes. They effectively work the same and they are both incredible, so they should be pursued with the same fervor and excitement, I would imagine. I'm cheating a little bit on this one, but we're going to talk about different lines of morphs, and that would be quite a few of them. Let's start with Exantic. Exantic has, I think, at least 4, with the VPI Exantic probably being the most popular. The TSK line, which stands for the Snake Keeper line. The Joliffe line, the MJ line, and the now, I believe this is the most recently discovered one, the GCR line of Exantic. And I had heard, I think one of them may actually end up proving to be the other. I'm not an expert on Exantic, I do not breed it, but in general, these lines, although they all look the same, you can't combine them. None of these are compatible. When you get these genetics that are kind of in the same family, some of them end up being allelic, but these look almost spitting image. Some people will tell you some of them might be better than others. I'll let people who work the lines have that argument, but they are effectively all kind of similar, if not the exact same, except that they're not. And you see this a lot in other genetics too that aren't recessives like Xanthic. The Barnhart Black Pastel was thought to be a polygenic trait of the Black Pastel line, but actually it's its own genetic that happens to be allelic with Black Pastel. So you can see the confusion. They exist on the same allele, so they essentially talk to each other, and they create a visual example of the Super Black Pastel, which comes with everything the normal Black Pastels have. Asphalt is another one in the Yellow Belly family. If you put Asphalt and Yellow Belly together, you create a freeway, for example, but there's another line of Asphalt, the RK line, which stands for Reptile Creations. These lines are a bit different. The Asphalt shows itself a little bit differently, but it is obviously in the same family because they work similar. If you put Asphalt, the RK line, together with Yellow Belly, you get a freeway, right? Except it looks like it's sideways. Here's a perfect example of that right here. So you do get the dorsal kind of going down the middle of it, but it looks different than a normal freeway would. But to be honest, they might not necessarily be breaking rules. It could very well just end up being a completely different morph, possibly. It would take a lot more study to completely understand if that is the case, but they effectively look very similar and are for sure allelic with the family of genes that they are related, except for, of course, those Xanthics that we mentioned earlier, which are recessive, and none of them are compatible. Not confusing at all, right? Next up would be allelic combos, which is going to be a video that we either have made already or will be coming out. But allelic combos are a little different than supers, but they kind of act the same. A super is an incomplete dominant with 2 copies present. So like the BELs we mentioned earlier, a super lesser. That is a super that will always pass 1 copy of its gene on. It will always make lessers. So any super would basically be something that does show an example with 1 gene present in its heterozygous form, and then when 2 genes are present in its homozygous form, they show another type of example, something different, sometimes very similar. Super Inchies are this way. There are quite a few awesome supers. So theoretically, if you get 2 different genes and mix them together, you should get something that has a unique blend and look to them, but they'll very similarly look the same. So if I put a leopard and a spot nose together, I get a leopard spot nose, which, you know, you're just missing clown. You're getting that Batman combo right there, right? So when I bred that animal, it would have a 50% chance of passing each of those genes on. You could theoretically pass both of them on. But what if I told you there are certain genes out there that don't behave like that? They behave like a super. Like freeways. Freeways are the combination of Asphalt and Yellow Belly. They are, however, allelic. They effectively exist on the same allele. So they act exactly like a super would, and in theory, exactly kind of almost how a recessive would, in that it's always going to pass on 1 copy of the gene. But which one? Well, you don't know. It's 50%. So when you pass on the genetic code of a freeway, you are always passing either Yellow Belly or Asphalt. Unfortunately, those two look very, very similar, so you're really not going to know unless you do a genetic test or eventually breed them out. Highways are also very similar, only instead of the Asphalt gene, you're talking about the gravel gene. Have you noticed a lot of these are road-related names? Well, there's a reason for that. They look like they have roads on their back. You'd think that this only works with incomplete dominants, right? But it doesn't. It works with recessives too in some cases, like the Candy and the albino gene. The albino creates a more yellowy tinged snake. Candy creates more lavenders, but when you get a Candy and an albino together, these 2 recessive morphs merge, meet on the same allele, and create what we call a Candino. Kryptons are another example. A clown and a cryptic, when mixed together, make a krypton, which has a very unique look to it, where it messes up the eye stripes but doesn't quite go the entire level that the clown does. Basically, what you have to understand about allelics is that they are both a blessing, but then can be a little difficult to breed. They can't reproduce themselves like other snakes can, very similar to how a super goes. A super will never have the opportunity to pass both copies of its genetic on, just like an allelic will never have the opportunity to pass both copies of its genetic along. So if you have a Enchi freeway, which is known as a Mardi Gras, it has Enchi, it has Yellow Belly, and it has Asphalt. If you breed that in other genetic combos, you're only going to get the Enchi moving along in a normal way. 50% of the time, Enchi will be there. But then you are guaranteed to either have Yellow Belly or Asphalt. So if you're trying to recreate freeways, you need something with that genetic in there, like Asphalt or Yellow Belly. And when you don't hit, you'll hit the super of the other one, obviously. Not confusing at all, right? I hope you're still with me. And lastly, what we want to talk about that don't follow the rules are recessives that aren't? I want to have the discussion. Not saying one way or the other, but recessives are defined differently than that of incomplete dominance. Incomplete dominance will show an example when just one copy is present, whereas a recessive, one copy of the gene is defined as having no visual example. You could not tell that the gene is present from just looking. You would have to either use our friends at RGI to do a genetic test, or you would have to breed it out to prove it out, especially if you went head to head. But having said all that, why do some recessives have what we call markers? If recessives have markers, isn't by definition them having a visual example? Everybody says that pieds have tracks along their tails that tell you, almost like a Sharpie, that this is a pied. However, I don't find this always to be the case. Sometimes, most of the time in fact, they do have this. But with it being so small of an example and not always being reliable, I would argue that that is a recessive, right? But then there's other recessives. When you're looking at a het zebra, it's obvious that it's a het zebra. They are incredibly visual. Monsoons are another one, have a pretty good marker. You have a lot of pattern that climb over them when they're in their heterozygous form. And it can be easy to tell, especially in just a het with no other genetics at play that could possibly mess this up or move it around the pattern that is. You can pretty much tell that it's a monsoon with not 100% accuracy, but pretty close. To add further confusion to it, there are genetics out there like Mackenzie and what we have here, Striker, that look almost identical to a het zebra. And when you get the super form of Striker and the Mackenzie, they look very similar to a zebra. So are they the same? I don't know. I haven't done any testing with that. I have Striker in my collection. I like the way it looks and I'm happy with it. That's all that really matters to me. Whether they're different lines of the same thing, it's hard to tell. I would actually love to find out that they're different lines, because maybe you get some crazy allelic combos, right? I would rather that be the case than anything else. But if they are the same, so be it. If they are different, so be it. They're still awesome. I could go on and on again with these recessives. There's a lot of examples of recessives that throw markers out there. So where do we define the line on what is recessive and what is not? Well, that's a question I think for geneticists. And if it isn't on a genetic level different, then I would say it's a difference of the example that throws it. And does it matter? A super is realistically the same kind of difficulty to make as a recessive. It's just the recessives don't show anything when it's just one copy of it. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Now, a lot of these that we talked about, they don't follow the rules, right? They follow their own rules. They aren't rules that are normal by any means, but that is what makes ball python breeding so darn fascinating in my opinion. It's that you've got all these awesome things that you can do and you know what to do, but then suddenly something comes in there and says, I'm going to turn this on its head and make it completely different. And what's cool about this is whenever it happens, it's almost always fascinating, sometimes frustrating, but almost always incredibly fascinating. There is a lot to understand, and some people look at the genetics and they say, I can't wrap my mind around it. And it's not something that you should wrap your mind around in one day. It's a consistent learning journey. It's something that you are going to learn and then you're going to need to relearn because you might be wrong. Things I said in this video, I could end up being proven to be a little off topic eventually. But the big takeaway from this all is that just because something doesn't follow the rules doesn't mean that it doesn't have a enormous and beautiful impact on ball python breeding. If you like this video, you can actually check out one of the many genetic videos we've done on ball pythons right here and here.